Welcome to Oh God What Now, the politics podcast that's not going to comment on speculation on topics that it's been briefing all and sundry about for weeks. I'm Andrew Harrison. Today, Jeremy Hunt wants to hammer the work shy, Gillian Keegan wants to take those awful noisy mobile phones off those awful noisy school children, potential leaders are queuing up to stab Sunak in the back, and Liz Truss has made her speech again. What will we make of the last Conservative Party conference before... Well, maybe it's just the last Conservative Party conference. Also, as Keir Starmer partially backtracks on his plans for private schools, why is it so easy to knock a Labour Party initiative off the tracks? Let's say hello to the panel. Newsnight legend Gavin Esler is the author of Britain is Better Than This, out now in all self-respecting bookshops. Hello, Gavin.
Hello.
Are you sure we're better than this? I mean, these days even the trees aren't safe, as lovers of the Sycamore Gap tree and Adrian's Wall will attest. A man in his 60s has been bailed over it. Some people were quite dismissive about the country mourning a tree. What did you think?
Well, I think we are definitely better than this. We're certainly better than allowing ourselves to be run by a bunch of lunatics, which we may get onto later in the programme. As for the tree, I don't know who the tree fella is or isn't. Or tree
it might have been just one fella, we don't know.
One fella, three fella. Exactly. It is a metaphor, though, for Britain today. You know, I don't know what this person's problems are, but you don't solve them by chopping down a sycamore tree that everybody else loves. And that seems to me to be, unfortunately, a metaphor for everything that happens in our politics, that we have got lots and lots of problems and you solve them by doing something really stupid.
Ros Taylor is a regular on a whole stable of podcasts, including our own show, Jam Tomorrow. Don't miss it. Hi, Ros.
Hello, Andrew.
There was a particularly ugly bit of politicking last week after the very shocking fatal stabbing of a 15-year-old girl in Croydon, followed by Roads Minister Richard Holden saying that Sadiq Khan had been too distracted with things like ULEZ to tackle London's knife crime. Does dragging tragedies like this in sort of towards a party's talking point at the moment ever work, or do voters just turn away in disgust?
Yeah, it sometimes works. I mean, knife crime is a big problem in London at the moment. It's another 15-year-old was stabbed to death in Enfield today. This is a city where routinely kids are stabbing and killing each other, and that is not a sign of a good city. The question is, who is to blame for that? And I think a lot of voters do not blame Sadiq Khan for it, because although he and Suella Braverman, as the Home Secretary, are jointly responsible for the Metropolitan Police, he has obviously been a very vocal critic of the police, and we know that the Met has enormous problems. Even the Met Commissioner himself is unhappy about his inability to sack bad officers. This is an organisation that needs radical reform. So I think that the attempt to pin it on Khan may well backfire, but that's not to say that people aren't very worried and very, very angry about this.
Mm. Seth Thévoz is a journalist and author of the tell-all book about London's private members' clubs behind closed doors. Hello, I said clothed doors. I'll do it again. That's a different kind of club.
They could be clothed as well.
Yeah. Seth Thévoz is a journalist and author of the tell-all book about London's private members' clubs behind closed doors. Hello, Seth.
Hello.
So we kind of ran out of popcorn last week over GB News' troubles. They've lost the Fun Boy 3 of Dan Wootton, Lawrence Fox and Calvin Robertson over Fox's fairly revolting sexist comments about Ava Evans. Ofcom received 7,300 complaints about this, which is more complaints than they have viewers sometimes. There's been a lot of talk about GB News at some sort of crossroads. Do you think that it is?
I'm not sure. I mean, remember, this is a channel that's in the Trump mould of very much wanting attention, wanting controversy. Let's just talk about these three as the Fun Boy 3, as you call them, because they are attention seekers. They are provocateurs. They are people who feed off others' anger. And the best thing you can do is to stop giving them publicity. And they'll do their usual shtick of complaining they've been cancelled and so forth. Nobody has a right to publicity and to wall-to-wall blanket coverage. And it's perfectly reasonable to just say, you're not very interesting and you don't have particularly interesting things to say. Unfortunately, I think they will be back. I mean, you need only look at how Nigel Farage was ousted from LBC Radio 3 years ago because there was some outrageous comments he made around the time of Black Lives Matter. And at the time, people said, he'll never work in radio or broadcasting again. He's still with us. Most people have forgotten that even happened.
I suppose the comparison to Fox News is interesting in that Fox News never apologises and never explains. And actually, GB News Management has been distancing itself at speed.
A little bit. I mean, there's been the spectre in the background of some sort of Ofcom intervention, but Ofcom is cautious at best. I think the likelihood of they'll do anything more than slap them on the wrist is pretty narrow. Remember, it took the invasion of Ukraine for them to actually go forwards and ban Russia Today. Up until that point, it was just, well, here's another small fine, but don't do it again. See you next week.
First this week, despite the best efforts of the country's royal unions, the Conservative Party conference is getting underway in Manchester. The Manchester stage of HS2 still remains Schrodinger's railway line, both alive and dead. But we've heard promises to punish the work shy and stop kids using mobile phones at school. It sounds very much like the Your Nan platform for an election. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak is optimistic that trying to end the so-called war on motorists, declared some years ago by Luddite ecomaniacs of the Conservative Party, will rescue him in the polls. Ros, the standout from the conference so far seems to be that very few people have turned up. They've had to move to a smaller hall. I've been to bigger sci-fi conventions. Is there a bit of a smell of death about this event?
Well, of course, I haven't actually been there. I'm in London, not in Manchester. Sadly, because I really enjoy party conferences. So I would love to find out if there was a smell of death, but I can't be there actually sniffing it. I think, viewing from afar, there is a sense that the right-wingers are on the front foot at this conference, and that the One Nation Tories are really taking a back seat because they're not steering the government agenda, and then they don't look like the people who have a good chance of winning a leadership contest next year either. But of course, a lot of it is, influenced by what the media is looking at. And of course, the media is looking at the right wingers. It's not really necessarily hanging out with David Gauke at the launch of his new book about the centre right last night, which I understand he did sell quite a lot of copies of that. So maybe there's more than I think. One of the problems with Tory conferences now is that a lot of MPs don't go. Some of them complain that they keep being pestered by lobbyists if they go, and there's no point. And of course, it's been very difficult to get there thanks to the rail strike. So that may be contributing to the sense of slight doom.
The Guardian's commentary is kind of drawing a line between sort of post-election, we're in for a battle between Trussite free marketers and faith, family and flag culture warriors like Miriam Cates, Danny Kruger, Patel and Braverman. Is it too early to get a sense of who might be getting, you're just saying the right-wingers on the front foot, but these are two flavours of right-winger. Yeah,
there are two interesting divisions here going on. My sense is that the faith, family and flag is in the ascendant. I mean, Liz Truss did give a speech today, but it was widely mocked. The people who are really getting attention are the people who have a decent chance of replacing Rishi Sunak in a leadership election. And Priti Patel was early off the starting blocks this time because she actually took on Suella Braverman over multiculturalism and suggested that her comments were quite offensive. So there are differences here. But remember, these are people with a lot still in common, who can coalesce later. It's worth remembering that Patel gave a full-throated defence of GB News last night. She gave a speech where she thanked them for absolutely everything they were doing, even, presumably, what they were doing last week. And Suella Braverman did an interview with Lee Anderson on GB News last week, just after getting back from her speech in the States, where she was criticising multiculturalism. They are both getting, they're both getting a good hearing. And while I think, as I say, it's Liz. Sorry, I'll start that sentence again. I think that the free marketeers are not in the ascendant at the moment, but that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody other than Liz Truss can't make some kind of comeback after the next election.
Seth, on those free marketeers, there was an absolute shock move, which nobody expected. Liz Truss called for tax cuts in her fringe speech. And she did actually draw quite a big crowd, whereas people like Grant Shapps have been speaking to largely empty rooms. Even Nigel Farage turned up to hear her speak. Do you think that point gives us a pointer to the future direction? She can get the crowds.
I don't know. I mean, what it tells us is that the next Tory leadership contest is already underway. They're expecting to lose the next election. They're expecting Sunak won't stick around and people are out on manoeuvres. Just because they're out on manoeuvres, it doesn't mean they have much of a following. Truss is at this very strange stage in her life where, understandably, if you've been ousted very quickly, you take a while to work out what your next step's going to be. In Truss's case, having spent the previous 12 years jockeying for position to become Prime Minister, she's decided to revert to jockeying for position to become Prime Minister. And I don't think anyone seriously expects this to work out, but it almost looks like force of habit.
Well, you say that, and I don't want to say that they're all mental, but she was signing copies of the mini budget, which is like, please have a signed copy of the thing that seems to have tanked the entire country. That's quite revealing, surely.
Yes. I mean, party conferences are fascinating beasts, and I love them because they are so mad. If you go to a Lib Dem one, it's all about how, you see, at last the media are here, people care about us. And if you go to a Labour one, it's very much, we're here. I'm not on the centre-left, I'm not on the left of centre, I'm on the left of the centre-left with the left of centre. And the Tory ones very much do feel like... how can we be absolute bastards now we're in power? And there is actually a refreshing candour to the Tory conferences, I find. People tend to be less guarded than at the other party conferences I've been to. So you do get these bits of lunacy that show themselves on the fringe. I have to say that the very professional-looking main stage isn't always that professional. We had the chairman of the Conservative Party, Greg Hands, getting out a pair of flip-flops for a publicity stunt. It looked awful. But on the fringe, you have something that reflects the heartbeat of where party activists are at. So the fact that Danny Kruger comes up with a conspiracy theory about global movements and this global government sort of mad stuff isn't important in itself. It's important that he got this amazing reception for that and people didn't just boo him out of the room straight away. Yeah,
and this was an event, I think, was it co-hosted by the IEA and the Taxpayers Alliance, that did kind of the same thing
All
anyway.
The old favourites.
Yeah, but it is odd that those kind of fringe things are being laundered into, all right, it's a fringe meeting, but Danny Kruger is a fairly kind of central MP. These fringe ideas are now being sort of brought in and kind of built into whatever the future offering is going to be.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, it's just like the Edinburgh Festival. I mean, the fringe is far, far more interesting than what is actually on the main stage, and far more meaningful, and tells you far more about the future direction of the party. I remember going to events which are really quite startling. Didn't get as much publicity as they do now because there are often relatively few journalists covering them, but that may change now.
I suppose the difference is we don't let the Edinburgh Fringe run the country.
Well,
at any point.
There aren't as many jokes.
No, there aren't. I mean, Truss, as I said, she made her speech, she argued for the same thing she always argues for driving down tax, cutting bills, building homes. It's a lot easy to argue for those things when you know you're not going to have to personally enact them because you will be out of cycle.
Yes, it's almost like listening to an opposition politician's speech.
Yeah. Gavin, Jeremy Hunt announced benefit restrictions for those who won't even look for work, including stopping benefits for those who are considered to be disengaged. Those who won't even look for work do not deserve the same benefits as people trying hard to do the right thing, he said. Apart from the fact that they've had 13 years to do something about this, are we kind of hearing a kind of comforting old tune for a party that's about to kind of go at best into hibernation? Or is there anything real to this?
Well, I think we are hearing a comforting old tune. I mean, if you were actually to put benefit restrictions on people who don't turn up for work, you'd begin with Nadine Dorris, perhaps, or you would move to members of the House of Lords, at least half of whom don't seem to turn up because there isn't even seating arrangements for them. So it is a very, very old trope. And this is a tired conference of tired people. It is, as Seth and Ros both said, it is a succession conference. It's a little bit of posturing to see about the future. The one thing I like the fringe things at conferences too, and I'm very impressed, as always, by Frank Luntz, who's an American conservative pollster, and he said the one thing that I would take away from this conference, unless something dramatic happens the next day or so, Luntz said, if you're a conservative member of parliament with a majority of less than 8,000, you may consider other employment opportunities. And I think that, because Luntz is a very sort of sensible guy, is really what this is about. And maybe that the idea of, benefit restrictions, how would that actually work? Who would implement them? What do you do with somebody who's physically okay, but maybe mentally is not fit to work? I can think of about 20 different things that you would have to consider here rather than the headlines. So this is not about policy, it's about headlines.
But also it's like...
And they'll get them.
Isn't this what they came in on anyway? Isn't this, a core of austerity? The memories of people being forced to go through humiliating personal assessments of their physical ability.
Yeah, it is exactly that. But it's also look over their politics. We know that there's so many of them who despise each other. We know that it's all a sort of beauty contest for people who are perhaps not entirely beautiful and trying to get to the top. And you are giving a bit of, who is the audience for this? There's very few people turning up. There's only about 160,000 Conservative Party members who pay £2.09 a month for the privilege, which is 2.5 Mars bars. So that's the audience for this conference, and a bit of the rest of us sort of paying attention on the sidelines. But, I was listening to a little bit of the interviews with people. I'm very excited about the Chancellor's speech, said Victoria Atkins MP. I mean, not many people are actually really very excited about the Chancellor's speech. Or Conor Burns talking about Liz Truss and not naming her, but talking about someone with a legendary lack of self-awareness. So you've got the two things going on there. They're trying to get some kind of excitement out of this. And frankly, most of the public won't care. And they're also quite clearly fighting those internal battles. And the rest of us don't matter very much.
In terms of getting the headlines, the Mail this morning went with the plan to stop kids in schools having their mobile phones. And Gillian Keegan made a real big deal about it in her speech this afternoon, which she conducted in walking about style, no lectern, very active. Ros, what did you think of this? Is it? I mean, it's obviously to go straight to the front of the Mail, but any value to it?
I'm actually all in favour, but it's worth pointing out that most schools already do ban mobile phones. This is all in the detail, basically, because they were always banned in lessons, obviously. So the question is, do you ban them in break times and lunch times, or do you ban them going anywhere near school at all? And how do you manage that? How do you police it? Do you have teachers wandering around at break time, making sure nobody's looking at their mobile phone, which is really quite hard to do with a load of, hundreds of kids? Or do you take them off at the beginning of the day and return them in the evening? Again, really time-consuming, tedious thing when phones all look the same. And so it's something that schools are already grappling with. It's not really new. But in principle, yeah, absolutely, there should be, mobile phones should be nowhere near, should not be on at any time during the school day, is my, I'm sorry, old-fashioned view.
I don't have kids, but I wouldn't disagree with that. But it's more the question of, why is this something a central government to be making a big deal out of? Well, surely any school will already, as you've just described, has it on their radar already. Why does it have to be a matter for central government?
Not all of them, it has to be said. I mean, I know parents who are a bit fed up because, their kids are allowed to use them at break time and there's bullying that ensues. So I can see why she's doing it. But in the context of everything else that is going on, is afflicting this country, it does seem rather trivial, yeah.
Seth, another sort of standout of the of events the first couple of days has been the New Conservatives group, who seem to have abandoned the national bit, campaigning to put withdrawing from the ECHR into the next manifesto. That idea has become pretty central to the Tory right. Does it have the same pull as, say, Brexit did for energising voters?
No, I doubt that in a cost of living crisis, people are saying we really care about the ECHR in this way. What it's about is an electoral strategy to move from unmanaged decline to some kind of managed decline, where at least you hold on to a chunk of your vote and you have people who agree with you on at least some of these things. What's striking about these new Conservatives is how noticeably old a number of them are. I mean, Sir Bill Cash is well into his 80s.
And he's not even standing next time, is he?
No, and Sir Ian Duncan Smith was a has-been 20 years ago when he lost the Tory leadership. Sir John Redwood, who first entered Parliament in 1987 and was last in government in 1995. These are not new Conservatives in any way, shape or form.
Ros, one of the things that's hanging over the whole event like a bad smell is HS2. The chief of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership said at the conference he was sick of being lied to about it. Sunak failing to answer the question about it over and over and over again on Koonsberg made Paxman and Michael Howard look like a model of candour and openness. What is the HS2 mess doing to the Conservatives at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, Birmingham to Manchester leg is dead in the water, isn't it? We all know it. He just hasn't said it yet. I mean, it's...
I'm not going to comment on speculation, Ros. It's speculation.
Spades are in the ground, Andrew.
Yes, that's a great way to build a giant railway, with spades, by hand.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things that makes the focus on relative trivia, like a ban on mobile phones in schools and all the war on motorist stuff, makes it seem even more of an elephant in the room than it already is. You know, the more you turn away from a big, big decision that has already cost billions and will cost billions more in order to focus on whether councils can implement 20-mile-an-hour zones and whether they all ought to be forced to use the same parking app, it's just... Which, is important. Don't get me wrong. There are people will be listening to that and thinking, yeah, that'd be good. I'm fed up with those parking apps. But this is so much more important than that and is so much more expensive. But the more you can distract people with these, little baubles, the more they think you can get away with not talking about the absolutely enormous stuff.
But isn't the... pardon me. Isn't the golden rule of bad news is you tell it as fast as possible, as comprehensively as possible, and you just get it out of the way?
No, I think they've adopted a new one. It's basically to refuse to say anything for so long that everyone now assumes that it's dead. So it's not going to come as a shock to anyone when Birmingham Manchester gets cancelled, or, as I expect will happen, postponed
And then
until economic circumstances change.
And then they'll be able to say, oh, but you knew at the time already. When we were denying it, you were telling us you knew.
Yeah, and you it's only postponed, I expect, until things are looking up, and then we can get those spades back in the ground again and build Britain.
And then you can announce 40 new HS2 extensions from Birmingham to Manchester.
Yeah, and it'll all be Labour's problem.
It will be Labour's problem. We should talk about the motorists thing. Gavin, I mean, they've made defending motorists, a word which even in itself sounds like it's from 1955, into the centrepiece of what's going on at the moment. Transport Secretary Mark Harper says 30 miles per hour, not 20 miles per hour, will be the default. Sunak's been attacking the Welsh Government's 20 mile per hour limit as not representative of British values. This is the transport policy of the 70s, isn't there? Is there really a constituency for it, or is it just like the Alan Partridge guys with driving gloves and car coats?
This is back to the 1970s. And in the 1970s, there was a very similar debate in 1973 where the motoring lobby opposed something called seatbelts. And it went on and on about everything from civil liberties to what's the point of it. And of course, it was defeated by common sense. And those of us who are drivers, and I'm a driver, I love my car, we're also pedestrians and we also breathe air. We don't want clean air, and we don't want to be hit by a car at 30 miles an hour if being hit by a car at 20 miles an hour is a lot less likely to kill us. So there's a lot of strange things going on here. But part of it is, of course, was revealed, I think, by Neil O'Brien, a Conservative MP, who tweeted a map of England and Wales showing places where essentially most people use their cars. And it was everywhere outside London. And you don't use your car in London if you can help it, because actually public transport in London is not too bad. And public transport everywhere else in England and Wales generally is not very good. As Andy Burnham would tell you in Manchester, he's trying to do something about it finally. So there's a lot going on here, but it goes back. I suspect it's quite interesting, Seth's comment about the new Conservatives, because I was thinking that a translation of that is, we're still conservatives. So whatever you liked about us in the past, we're still that, but we're new conservatives. So whatever you don't like, we must be something else. I mean, it's a kind of, the whole conference is filled with references to the past and policies of the past, or attempts to subvert policies of the past which failed, and a prospect that they're somehow new. And it's very, very hard sell. I don't think it's working somehow.
Well, by Wednesday, we'll know what Sunak's speech consisted of, and we'll be talking about that on Wednesday's show. But at this point, we're kind of halfway through the conference. Is it possible to kind of give a verdict? Conferences are there to generate positive energy, positive headlines, to give the sense of momentum. And I don't know, are we getting that? Listen, looks of blank horror in the studio.
Nah, conference is a massive booze up.
Yeah, they didn't even look that drunk.
The days of caution and embarrassment are over. It is freedom time, freedom to pollute, freedom to pay as little tax as possible, say things the woke left doesn't like. It's freedom time. And, we're all in the last chance saloon, so why not?
That's a great place for a sting. Next up, time to choose our hero and villain of the week. Each member of the panel will suggest a hero and a villain. They will make their pitch, and I will arbitrarily decide who's the winner. Seth, let's start with you.
Yes, many of you will know that I have no interest at all in football, but I'd like to nominate Gary Lineker just because he's managed to win against a set of broadcasting rules that were essentially brought up to placate the Conservative Party as much as possible, and just being quite reasonable about it all, he's forced the complete back down for all non-political pundits on the BBC.
Yeah, so the new guidance rules that have come in are kind of quite Lineker friendly.
Yeah, it's sort of don't do anything hugely stupid, don't endorse a party, but otherwise you can, just support causes as you see fit. That's fine. And my villain of the week would be the entire US Senate, because at a time where we've come very close to shutdown of the entire US government and gridlock and so forth, their priority last week was reinstating the dress code to make sure that Senator John Fetterman would wear a tie into the chamber in future.
Right, okay, important stuff. Ros, who are you going for hero and villain?
My hero is Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Because I think this is a very timely choice. I mean, obviously the guy's been dead a while, but he really did some amazing things with railways. He actually changed the standard gauge of railways in the UK when he built the Great Western Railway, and he did some other amazing engineering feats as well. And I think he's someone we can all take inspiration from at a time like this, don't you, Andrew?
Could well do. I was on the Great Western Railway only yesterday, and I thought the gauge was fantastic. Why now in particular? Is it because we need rail thought? We need future rail optimism.
I'm just thinking about a rail project that might have been built and hasn't been built. That's all I'm thinking about, Andrew.
Fair enough. Okay. How about your villain?
Oh, my villain is mosquitoes. I personally have a massive, massive problem with mosquitoes. I mean, but obviously in a very northern hemisphere way, in that they just bite me and it turns into enormous red wheals. But I don't catch malaria, and malaria is nonetheless a huge problem. And the good news this week is that there is a new cheap malaria vaccine, which means there are 2 now, and this will save literally millions of lives. And it's also important for Europe because eventually the mosquitoes will start moving even further north because of climate change, and will carry malaria with them there. So this is fantastic news.
This is my mosquito fact. The only mosquito fact I've got, which is that apparently malaria is very common in East Anglia.
Yes,
in the 17th century.
Fens,
and it was known as the night chills. He was carried off by the night chills.
Also in Kent. I mean, I expect Gavin knows that. It was very common in the bit of Kent that was only recently drained.
There you go.
Good grief.
So beat that, Gavin, for your heroes and your villains. Who have you got?
Oh, well, I'm quite alarmed about the prospect of mosquitoes in Kent carrying malaria. My hero of the week is President Jimmy Carter, 99 years old. He wasn't the greatest president in American history, but he's a great man, and he has done really good things. And the Carter Center from Nicaragua, I met him there when he was trying to bring democracy to that place, to Zimbabwe and other places. He is a good man, and I think we should celebrate him for that. My villain of the week is the water companies again. I mean, they are just shocking. Now the idea is that we should see a rise of an average of £156 in our annual bills to pay for them to do what we thought we were paying for them to do anyway, which is provide us with clean water and not pollute our seas and rivers with sewage. I think that is absolutely shocking, unbelievable. They are the villain, not just of the week, they're my villain of the year.
Well, Fergal Sharkey, soon to be, we hope, Lord Fergal Sharkey, was doing the media around, pointing out that they are insisting that we pay twice for the thing we were already paid for, which they had instead diverted the money off into dividends. Well,
yeah, that's it. But it's nice work if you can get it. Obviously, we've got to crack down on benefit cheats, but we're not allowed to suggest in any way that there's something odd about paying for something which we don't get from companies who, I think it's 1 trillion litres of water a year. I don't even know what that is, but it's a lot. 1 trillion litres of water a year is lost through burst pipes that haven't been replaced. That's just shocking.
Another one that takes me back to the glory days of the pre-New Labour government, when blowing up water companies for leaks was a huge part of undermining the credibility of the Major government. So time has become a loop again. Okay, you've given me a very, very tough set of choices here. I think we're going to go with hero. We'll go with Jimmy Carter, because at 99, and the man who was too decent to be a good American president, I think we can give him that. Very difficult if it's a toss-up. I think water companies will be villains again at some point. In fact, water companies will be recur every other week. Mosquitoes, I don't know. I think I'm going to have to give it to the US Senate, not just for the dress code, but because for part of the deal for not shutting down the government was effectively to withdraw support to Ukraine. Simply in cheap political horse trading to throw away the support to a country that's fighting for its own independence and its own democracy. Kind of the thing the United States is there for. I thought that was particularly shameful. Don't worry, Ros, mosquitoes will get their day another time.
Good.
Now I'm going to do private schools. Now, an update from the short-lived policy desk. Last week, Labour announced plans to revoke the charitable status of private schools, thus ending their exemption from VAT at 20% and raising an estimated £1.7 billion for the state sector. After a predictable reaction from the Conservative press, headlines about class war, claims that the move would actually disadvantage state school pupils, special pleading about tiny specialist schools, the policy was modified. Instead, Labour would remove unfair tax breaks without changing the rules on charitable status, which they said would have become too complicated and open to legal challenge. In short, a bit like Labour distancing itself from ULEZ after the Uxbridge by-election, it didn't take much to knock a flagship policy off course. Why? Full disclosure, Ros and Gavin have kids. Seth and I don't, that we know of. Ros, what do you think about Labour reworking this key policy so quickly and so fundamentally after such a minor, shall we say, backlash?
So the first thing to say is that it's still quite a big change. I mean, schools will no longer be VAT exempt, and that means an extra 20% on the fees, which parents do not like, and that is why the protests have not gone away. That said, as you say, charitable status will make it easier for parents to donate money because there are tax advantages to donating money when you earn a lot, especially when you're saving an awful lot. And I expect schools to take full advantage of that by switching to fundraising rather than necessarily putting up fees.
Jam and cakes, little things like that.
Well,
gigantic cakes costing hundreds of thousands of pounds.
There will certainly be ways around it, and they will be very pleased about that. But to answer your question, it's partly the result of being in optimism. It's partly the result of being in opposition. I mean, governments also U-turn all the time on policy under pressure from lobby groups, but oppositions don't have the civil service to do their research. And so inevitably their proposals can be less well thought out. And this is one of the proposals that basically survived the Corbyn era. There aren't really very many in the Labour Party that have done that. And they realised that it probably wasn't such a good idea to go ahead with this because it was just financially, it was logistically very, very complex thing to do. But that was pointed out to them and they changed. And they would say, Starmer's response has been that they want to make policy bulletproof and that they're working on it all the time. And as I say, there's a case to be made for why oppositions do find it hard to make really good policy.
West Streeting said it's not about the principle of charitable status, but about what works. But surely it kind of is about the principle, the idea that you should not give charitable status to institutions that enable people to buy better education for their kids. If you do that, maybe you should be allowed to do it, but you should expect to be taxed, and the institution should expect to be taxed. And it shouldn't be under the umbrella of charity.
Yeah, I mean, what works is what brings in more money for the state sector. And what's the best way of extracting money from richer people and giving it to the schools that poorer people attend. Of course, the argument of parents who go private is that they are saving the state the cost of educating their child and that they're already paying twice through their taxes and to the private school. And sometimes they argue as well what the state provides is simply not good enough, so that they have, in all good conscience, no choice. That is the argument that is being made. So this is a classic freedom of choice issue.
Gavin, what do you think? I mean, has this shown Labour to be a kind of mature and listening opposition, or is it do they simply bottle it on something that is kind of core to what Labour ought to be about?
Well, I think, as Ros said, they're not in government, and they you can also U-turn from a U-turn. They can say we're developing our policy. I think, look, most parents are aspirational. Most parents, however, cannot afford private school fees. Only 7%, I think it is, of children go to private schools. And as Ros said, the parents who send them to private schools are paying, in their view, twice, because they're paying in the tax for everything else. The real problem with our schools is the underfunding of state schools. I mean, who would have thought that we would still be talking now in 2023 about bits of concrete perhaps falling off roofs of schools, which could have been dealt with years ago, with the problem with rack concrete. And so I suspect that this is not a big issue for Labour, who want to keep the thing. If you're a leader of the opposition, there are some things you don't want to make news about particularly. And getting involved in the charitable status, which, as Ros says, is very, very complicated. We've got all kinds of strange charities who benefit from charitable status, including some of the right-wing think tanks that we were talking about. So once you start opening that, that's much more difficult than simply saying VAT will be charged or not charged. That's something that you can do as a government. So it's a more complicated question. But I actually think that in terms of a political issue, I'm not sure if most parents care about other parents paying for going to private school. Some will, and some just simply won't. They'll just see it as they're trying to do the best for their children.
Sunak's attack line on this was that Labour just don't understand the aspiration of families like my parents who were working really hard, which kind of implies that people who don't send their kids to, or find the money to send their kids to private schools, aren't working really hard. And it seems to be a strange angle to take.
I think that is a completely wrong angle to take. I shouldn't be advising them, but I think we should. I think if you were advising them, you would say it's a freedom of choice issue. People can do what they wish with their own money. You can't make the state do them something different. And also, it's been part of the British tradition. A more interesting British tradition is the fact that 20 out of 57 of our prime ministers went to one private school called Eton. That is very odd. We are a very odd country in that respect. And that is something that we should look at. Whereas whether some parents choose to send to a local private school, that is very, very different.
But a lot of people would say that effectively it is about privilege, and you have to, you cannot simply start doing something about the monopoly on prime ministers that Eton might have without looking at the whole system. And that simply tinkering around the edges and saying removing VAT does not attack the principle that you can actually buy your kids into a better life.
Well, I think that is true, actually. But what we need to do, therefore, because the core problem is to improve the schools that most people would like to send their children to, which are the ones that the state pays for and hasn't paid enough. And that's one reason why class sizes are much too big in many public schools. Public schools is the Americanism. That's one reason why class sizes are much too big in many British state schools, because of the lack of investment. And that was not the case from 1997 to 2010, when there was massive investment in schools, in school buildings as well, which has not been carried on since 2010 and austerity. That is the core problem.
Seth, the hopeful prospective Tory candidate Seb Payne says of private schools that there's so much more to the sector than the aristocratic aesthetics of Eton or Harrow. But when even the cheapest private school costs £1,500 a year, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies says the average private school charges about £15,000 a year, is that really true? I mean, people are not simply buying a version of the local comp that's got a better maths teacher.
Where I think he does have a point is that, as well as being private schools, they're independent schools. And so that means the curriculum can be very different indeed. It means that the teachers may not have gone through a particular qualification. Instead, they'll have unusual backgrounds. They can experiment. They can be creative. They can be unusual. The solution to that, surely, is to have state comprehensives which also can experiment and which can have that level of flexibility as well. The flip side of it is that there are loads of really mediocre public schools out there. There are loads of really mediocre. The idea that we have only great private schools and only terrible state schools is really the fallacy at the centre of this. And of course, where he's completely wrong is around the pricing that we're talking about. It's not just the average is $15,000 a year you mentioned. Well, there are schools in the Premier League which charge $15,000 a term. So the idea that this is somehow accessible to all, or that the fig leaf that you have just a small number of scholarships, you say, well, we'll give that out and that'll make up for it all. No, clearly that's not the basis of a better education system. One weird thing in all of this, I've been following opinion polls quite closely lately, and there was a very detectable rise of about 3-4% in the Conservative vote at exactly the time of the concrete scandal. And so somehow, somewhere out there, there is a demographic that wants lousy concrete in state comprehensives.
Demographic that hates their kids. That's what it is. I mean, I know a few parents like that.
Who are these people? I mean, genuinely.
Well, being more serious about it, there's, we're all familiar with the idea of in America of the notion of the kind of temporarily embarrassed millionaire. The idea that people think that they are destined to be more prosperous than they really are. Yeah. Consequently, they are, violently opposed to heavy taxation for the very rich, and they have strong opinions about share ownership and property and stuff like that they'll never actually practically encounter.
Yeah, and that's very much at the root of this. Yeah. It's this libertarian mindset.
But, it's the libertarian with no money is what I'm talking about.
But it's also true of inheritance tax, isn't it? Most people will not pay inheritance tax, and yet because it's been badged as a death tax, as if you're taxed on death, you're not actually, because you're dead. The people who are taxed are the people who get the money, and there's very few of them, and very few of us will pay it because we don't have the money. But it's interesting that it is a live issue for some people.
Yeah, the inheritance tax is being sold as a kind of a hugely important moral issue that will affect all of us. And it's, in practical terms, it's a tiny minority.
Because self-identification is so important in politics. And never mind the objective factors of who we are or where we are, it's how we see ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, most people think they're middle class, even if they're upper class or not middle class. They think that because that's what they aspire to be. And it's exactly the same in America.
Ross, the pushback against the removal of charitable status for private schools in the press was predictably overwrought. We saw Labour tax will mean private schools will concentrate on foreign pupils. We saw Labour's war on private schools. There's so many wars. It's like this is like the 18th century. There's wars overlapping over everything. It will penalise state school pupils somehow. Labour wants to abolish private schools. The Telegraph is today claiming that Labour is using lawfare against existing schools by requesting information about them, presumably to make better policy about them. I don't know if it actually counts as lawfare. And my favourite was it told its readers that they could avoid the VAT simply by paying £60,000 in fees up front. Dead simple. We should all be doing it. Is this kind of pitch of anger and overwrought analysis in any way representative of what the British people really think? Do people care that much about it?
No, I don't think so. But it comes back to what we were just saying about inheritance tax. A lot of people would like to be the kind of people who could afford to send their kids to private schools, and maybe they would like to hold that option open for themselves. And in that case, they would rather, as they see it, not be punished for it. So Labour is playing a difficult game because while it is, self-evident that 93% of British kids go to state schools, so obviously those parents care deeply about what their kids' school is like. That doesn't close off, for some of those, the thought that they would quite like to have the option of going private. And so it's a battle line that you can see the Tories setting up and are about to take advantage of. I was listening to Claire Coutinho, the new Net Zero Secretary today, attacking Labour's net zero position as ideological. Now, I don't think that Labour's net zero position is remotely ideological. I think it's incredibly pragmatic. But that's how she was portraying it, because she was portraying it as an attack on freedom of choice. And this is how all this relates to the war on motorists. The war on motorists is all about freedom of choice and freedom to do what you want. The Tories now want to be seen as the practical, what works party, people getting on with their lives, not hindered by ideology or bossiness or envy or a desire to punish people. And they want to portray the Labour Party as doing all those things. So those lines are being drawn, and in the course of this conference, they are getting quite a bit sharper.
What's more ideological?
Could I just say that one of the problems
Go ahead.
Could I just say one of the problems with that is that if you're portraying yourself as the practical party, it's very, very difficult to do that when people look around and think things don't work. There's so much that doesn't work. The trains don't work. The NHS strike, the doctors strike. And I think Ros is absolutely right. They're trying to do it. But it is a very, very difficult act to pull off when if you go to, I've been to a lot of book festivals recently, and the one grumble from audiences repeatedly is, why does nothing work the way it used to? And we can say that perhaps the past wasn't all that glorious. But to present yourself as a practical problem-solving party when in the reality of our daily lives are that you can't get a doctor's appointment, the trains might not be running, or if they are, they're overcrowded, and all the complaints that we constantly make, that is very difficult. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're in such difficulty, because they're great at salesmanship, but the thing doesn't start when you get the engine turning over. It doesn't work.
And you can only, believe that Britain is not broken, as you say, Gavin, if you are the kind of person who doesn't really use things in the state sector very much, who doesn't use state schools, as most Tory politicians don't, who doesn't use the NHS if they can possibly avoid it because they can afford to go private, rarely uses public transport. These things, it is possible to live in that world if you don't experience it on a daily basis.
It's also funny to get all worked up about war on the motorist when you don't actually drive because you're chauffeured. Just to wrap this up, I mean, polling has been extremely weird over the past few days. The Labour leader's been at anything from, I think, 24 points to 10 points, which is a huge margin of error. Okay, it's conference season and things are weird, but do people actually pay attention to conferences? Seth, do you think we should be just avoiding the polls until we're out of conference season?
I don't think it's that weird. I mean, firstly, yes, because conference season always means a publicity boost, although that can be a bad thing in some cases. The margin of error is usually at least 3%. I think actually it's more like 4 or 5% on quite a few of these polls. And so that means a band of anything from 6 to 10%. So it's roughly indicative. Individual polls really don't matter. What matters are the broader trends on these things.
And that's the end of the show, which means it is time for Escape Routes, where we talk about the books, films, music, and or miscellaneous that's getting us through the churn of politics at the moment. Gavin, what is your escape route?
I've been reading quite a lot of books, but my real escape route is I've just about an hour ago come out of the sea. I was in having a swim. It's October and the sea is still warm. And where I go in Kent, the beach is beautiful and the water is clean. So Southern Water have failed to do what other people have done. Or maybe they're doing it somewhere else, but certainly the beach here is good.
So climate change fringe benefit, the water's still warm in October.
Yeah, well, that too, I suppose.
Ros, you're also an infamous wild swimmer in the sea. What has been your escape route in the past couple of weeks?
Sadly, I've not been able to get to the sea for a couple of weeks. I'm very sad about that. I'm hoping to go next Sunday. And this is not really getting away from politics, but I'm going to the Green Party conference on Saturday, and I'm quite excited about that because, like Seth, I love party conferences, and I've never been to the Green one before. It's in Brighton as well, so I might be able to fit in a
It would be in Brighton, wouldn't it? Absolutely.
Of course it's in Brighton. So, if you're green, let me know, and we can meet up for a chat because I need to write a piece for another outlet about what's going on at Green Conference and what Greens are really thinking.
I bet the Green Conference is really groovy.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you all about it.
I bet the music's great.
Yeah.
I bet the snacks and the nibbles are fantastic.
Yeah.
Seth, how about you?
I've been enjoying David Kynaston's new book. He's done this whole series on post-war Britain. So the new one is called A Northern Wind. It covers 1962 to 5. So if you think that's a small spread, his last one was just about the summer of 1962.
All right.
But this one's looking at the grittiness of Britain in the early 60s. It's looking at things like the Beatles and what that does to pop culture. It's really very well written.
So it's a kitchen sink politics book.
Absolutely.
Sounds great. I loved Austerity Britain. I thought it was fantastic. Austerity Britain came out when we thought austerity was the thing of the 50s and we'd never hear the word again. They are fantastic readers' books, aren't they? Well, my escape routes. Last week I mentioned "Oh Brother" by John Niven, his memoir about the death of his brother and how he and his brother's lives had diverged. John went into the music business and became a writer, and his brother kind of went into the demi-monde in Scotland. When I recommended it, I hadn't finished it, and when you get to the end, the final chapter is genuinely flooring. It is an incredible piece of writing, so I'm giving that a double recommend. But the one that I've also been reading is A Natural History of the Future, What the Laws of Biology Tell Us About the Destiny of the Human Species by Rob Dunn. And it is a biologist bringing in studies of natural history, but also statistics to project what is likely to happen in the world that we have changed. And it's chiefly about how life processes always elude humans' ability to change them. We might end up eradicating a lot of species and possibly ourselves, but life will go on in ways we do not expect. And it's full of absolutely astonishing stuff, like the fact that the human biomass is now far greater than pretty much any species of vertebrate. Obviously, the biomass of insects outweighs all of us. I didn't know that the yeasts that make beer come from inside the bodies of wasps. So, part of old stingo. And another mosquito fact for you, Ros. An entirely new species of mosquito has evolved in the London Tube to take advantage of the temperature and environment in there. So, Cockney mozzies will get you on the Victoria line.
I knew that. I also heard a slightly new species of mouse that evolved too, which I can believe.
Yes.
One that doesn't need sunlight.
Did we mention the new crab that's evolved in the Cloaca Maxima in Rome? The gladiator crab. It's a freshwater crab. So basically, you tend to hear from creationists on the kind of Louis Theroux type documentary. They say nobody's ever seen evolution ever happening. It's just a theory. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in the tube. It's happening in the sewers of Rome.
Life, life, as Jeff Goldblum assured us, will find a way.
It will indeed. Well, we were so concerned about making a podcast that we never stopped to wonder if we should make a podcast, but we have, and it's called Oh God, What Now? Thank you, Ros.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Seth.
Cheers.
We'll be back on Friday or Thursday if you're a Patreon person. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy the rest of the Conservative Party conference, and we'll see you next time.